That's all I had to say about gray matter. Let's talk about white matter. And I want you to think of white matter like a highway. It's neurons running up and down, bringing information to the brain or from the brain. The neurons have information that can get off at different exits, and those exits would be the spinal nerves that exit the spinal cord and turn into the nerves that are in your body. Before we talk about spinal white matter, there's some generalizations that we can make. There's some good terms. White matter has neurons that do something called decussation. So neurons are capable of going from one side of the spinal cord to another. Decussation is just crossing over. That's all. In a contralateral reflex, you obviously have decussation because you're controlling muscles on the other side of the body. Spinal white matter is mostly like relays of neurons. It's not one neuron that goes from a pressure sensor in your skin all the way to the brain. There's usually a few. So there's synapses. They relay. We can label the neurons, the first one, the second one, the third one. Although you think that white matter is just a mass of tangled neurons, it's not. The neurons in white matter that run up and down have a very precise relationship, and that's called somatotropy. Spinal white matter, unlike the brain, spinal white matter is exactly the same on the left and the right. The brain didn't have that, right? The brain had differences left and right, but in the spine, all the same. And actually, symmetry, it actually applies to the gray matter as well. That's not unique to spinal white matter. Spinal white matter is myelinated because it is white matter. I'm just saying it's white because there's myelin involved, and that indicates to you that spinal white matter is pretty much all axons. There are no cell bodies in spinal white matter. It's all myelinated axons. All right, so when we think about the spinal cord, before you look at this picture here, there are pathways, specific neurons that we know carry specific information. And pathways can run in three directions. There can be neurons that are bringing information up to the brain, and those are called sensory pathways. When I went to school, they were called ascending pathways. Sometimes you can call them afferent pathways. There are also neurons that are bringing information from the brain down to a certain level of the spine and out the spine. Those neurons are called descending pathways. In our class, we call them motor. When I went to school, they were called efferent. All of these words mean the same thing. There is a third type of pathway that's called a transverse pathway or a commissure, and this is information that carries. This is a pathway or neuron that carries information from one side of the spinal cord to another. That's basically decussation, right? There are neurons that do that, that take information from the left side and bring it over to the right side. All right, now thinking about these pathways, they all have axons that are bringing information of a similar destination. And so when I say that, I mean that sensory neurons that bring information that you're aware of have a similar destination for the thalamus. Sensory neurons that have information that you're probably not aware of probably go to the hypothalamus. But axons that are near each other, they have similar destinations. We can label tracts that are even more specific. So they're bringing information not only to the thalamus, but a specific part of it. We're not going to get so specific in this class. We're going to look at 3 pathways that go up and 3 pathways that go down. This picture is not from your book. Your book has something similar. This picture has the 3 sensory pathways. So now, again, I need you to imagine that this white matter, because that's what this slide is about. We're talking about just the white matter of the spinal cord. And we're talking about just the neurons in the white matter that are carrying sensory information. So you have to imagine neurons in these columns here rising up and bringing information to the brain. So let me draw one. There's a neuron in your body that enters this way, and it might synapse with another neuron that brings the information to what's called the posterior column. And that is a neuron that rises up and brings information to the brain. I do not need you to know the specifics of the column. I just need you to know the general pathways. So there's the green pathway, which is scattered throughout the white. And notice the white matter is the same on the left and the right. The green pathway is the spinothalamic. And this pathway is named for its origin, the spine, and its destination, the thalamus. Whenever you hear thalamus, you can think that it's conscious. So this carries information like pain. And my spinal cord stimulator targets this pathway. In fact, it disrupts the action potentials rising up on this pathway. And although I am in pain, my body does not sense that. There's the posterior column, which is not named for its origin and destination, but that's the big blue area here. It's it's named more for its location on the spine in the posterior column of white matter. It carries tons of stuff: pressure, temperature, even a little pain, but most of it is conscious things. The spinocerebellar are neurons that would run up the spinal cord in these yellow areas here. And that is usually unconscious information. So that's information like the position of your knee, how flexed your hip is, how contracted one of your muscles is. That's usually proprioception, which has to do with your balance, like your place. Your balance, that's all I can say. So this one is named for its origin, the spine, and its destination, the cerebellum. And the cerebellum has lots of information about balance and posture. That's what I was looking for, posture. So these are the three major pathways. I would hope that if I said Joe has damage to his spinocerebellar pathway, you would say, oh, he probably has issues with his balance. Right? He can't really get a good posture or balance. I would hope that if I said, I have a spinal cord stimulator disrupting action potentials in the spinothalamic pathway, you would say, oh, that's conscious information. You probably don't sense that you're in pain. I don't. It gets a little easier to understand about the pathways in the white matter of the spinal cord when you start to look at what some of the injuries do. So this picture here has like a penetrating injury or a compression injury to the dorsal column or the posterior column in the spine. And this column carries, we said that this carries lots of different information. And look at the damage or the type of damage that, or the type of symptoms that the person feels when they have damage to this posterior column. Loss of light touch, vibration, position sense, generalized sensation, right? And we said that this posterior column carries lots of information. So they have lots of issues with carrying this type of information to their brain. All right, let's say that you get a penetrating injury, a compression injury, something that damages this, the spinothalamic tract. Now, this is the tract that brings conscious information or pain information. It also carries temperature. So look at the suite of symptoms that we get here: loss of pain sensation and temperature sense. So damaging the tract means that you prevent that type of information from getting to the brain. Okay, now let's look at the three motor pathways. Now, again, I'm looking at only spinal white matter, and the white matter in specific areas has axons that is bringing information down. So these colored areas here in blue and like light and like a brownish tan there, those colored areas have axons that are running in a similar destination, and they're carrying information from the brain to areas in the body. So like there's a neuron that's descending from the brain and it gets to this little purple area here, and there's some other synapses that it does. But it basically carries information that leaves through the ventral root. So there are 3 pathways that you need to know. Thankfully, the first one is named well. The other 2 are named for their position and not what they do. And again, I don't need you to know the subtract, just the pathways. There's the corticospinal pathway, which is the most important one I want you to know. So it is named for its origin and destination. It starts in the cortex of the cerebrum, and it ends in the spine. So it carries conscious information because it's coming from your cerebrum. So this is move your arm. There you go. Information traveled down your corticospinal pathway, and then it left at a certain level of your spine and allowed you to flex your arm. Damage to this pathway would produce paralysis. The other 2 pathways are named for their location. The lateral pathway, because it's on the side of the spine, and the medial pathways, because they're toward the middle of the spine. They're all kind of used together. They used to be called the pyramidal pathways, but the lateral and medial, we can generalize them and say that it's unconscious information. So squeeze your pancreas right now. I'm kidding. So information that is coming from your brain telling you to increase information in your vagus nerve carries information to your digestive organs. That information would be traveling down the lateral and or the medial pathways. So some of your visceral organs are served by lateral and medial pathways. Again, this becomes easy to understand if we understand damage. So, common damage, penetrating injury, compression, and let's say that we damage the corticospinal pathway that carries conscious information. Now, now you've got issues like weakness, right? You can't control it. Or you might have issues like hyperreflexia, where you've got too much flexion happening, but you can't control that. So this is what can happen with damage to the corticospinal pathway. All right, let's put it all together. You can. I know that you can. Before we get started, let's look at a few things. We've got a neuron down here, and let's call that the neuron of the first order. This white neuron here, let's call that the neuron of the second order. And then we have a black neuron up here in the brain. Let's call that the neuron of the third order. How did I know that? That's just what we call them. How did I know to order from bottom to top? Because we're going to describe sensory here. So we have information that's going to move into the spine and up to the brain. Let's notice some other things. We have a synapse of the second and third neuron, and that's in the thalamus. I'm telling you that. We also have a synapse down here, and that seems to be in the dorsal horn of the gray matter. Let's put it all together. Let's say that we're transferring pain. Okay, let's do that because that's conscious, you're aware of it. Right? What would be the sensory receptor? It would be a nociceptor. And let's say that you have it in skeletal muscle. That's where we're going to put it. Right? So the sensory neuron is in skeletal muscle. It's a nociceptor. And it's connected to an axon that comes into the spinal cord and has its cell body in that dorsal root ganglion. Now, this neuron that has the nociceptor comes into the spinal cord and it synapses in the dorsal horn of the gray matter. And we know that that area is the synapse where you transfer or talk about somatic sensory information. Okay, before we rise up to the spinal cord, we're going to do something that white matter generally does. We're going to go over to the other side of the spinal cord, and that's called decussation. And we know that white matter does that. Now, we're carrying conscious information. So what tract is this? Now, number one, it's a sensory tract. And since we're carrying conscious information, and I told you that we're going to the thalamus, this would be the spinothalamic tract. This neuron, number 2, is part of a group of neurons that brings information to the thalamus. This is conscious information. Once we get to the thalamus, we have a synapse up there, and the thalamus is like, it's kind of like a phone operator. It's like, where should I direct your call? And the thalamus directs the information to the right area of the brain. If it's pain, if it's temperature, or if it's anything else that would come from the somatic area. We can do the same thing for motor pathways. And it's actually even easier. Motor pathways usually only have 2 neurons. There's usually one neuron that descends all the way from the brain down the spine to the level of exit. So like these 2 neurons here, they're descending all the way down the spinal cord to the level of exit. Then at the level of exit, they synapse with another neuron that carries the information out of the spinal cord and out to the designated muscles, whether that be skeletal or smooth or even cardiac. So we can have neurons of the first and second order, but we don't call them that with motor neurons. With motor neurons, we say that there's an upper motor neuron. That's just the one that originates in the brain. There's a lower motor neuron. That's the one that originates in the spinal column. So we have upper and lower motor neuron. It's important to note where they synapse, and it's important to note where they decuss or where they cross. So you can take a look down here. The crossing is at the lower level, and the synapse is in the ventral horn of the gray matter. And we know that somatic motor information, synapses, neurons carrying that information will synapse in the ventral horn. Oh, and I'm sorry, by what root? We leave by the ventral root. Oh, I already said that.